The Young and the Restless spoilers next 2 week June 30th to July 11th 2025 as the echoes of the storm faded and the soaked fields around Genoa City began to dry. The real damage from Kane Ashby's twisted orchestration was only beginning to surface. Somewhere between France and home, the spell was breaking, but not fast enough. And while the guests of Kane's lavish French estate gathered their things, made polite farewells, and tried to pretend they hadn't all just spent the past few days trapped in an elaborate, gilded illusion, Adam Newman was already moving. Quite literally. Boots soaked, jacket torn, and resolve burning hotter than ever, Adam was walking along the twisted remnants of storm-destroyed train tracks, determined to reach Victor in person. He could have waited. He could have called. But he knew Kane. He knew how distraction worked. And he knew that what was unfolding back home in Genoa City couldn't wait another moment. By the time Adam reached Victor's temporary suite, the old titan was preparing for the return trip, still digesting the humiliation of Kane's con, still brooding over what it meant. But Victor's anger had not yet caught up to the scope of the threat, and that was what worried Adam most. So he laid it out quickly, breath ragged, clothes soaked. Kane is using the party as misdirection. He never gave up on Chancellor. He's moving while we're stuck in Europe. And if we don't stop him now, we're going to lose a lot more than a company. Victor stiffened but said nothing. Adam knew what that meant. His father was processing. Calculating. And somewhere deep inside that calculation was the fear that this time, Victor had been played, and played well. But would it be too late? Even as Adam sounded the alarm, the web Kane had spun back home was tightening. Devon Winters, far from being merely suspicious, was actively investigating. After returning to Chancellor Winters from the so-called Dumas affair, Devon had felt it in his bones, something was off. He didn't trust Kane's silence. He didn't trust the party. He didn't trust the timing. He had walked through that estate with one eye on the exits, waiting for a reveal that never came. And now, back in Genoa City, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd all been pawns in a performance meant to keep them distracted while something vital was taken from under their noses. So he turned to the one person he thought might still know Kane's plans, Amanda Sinclair. But that conversation would not go the way Devon hoped. Amanda, already furious with him for reasons far deeper than Kane Ashby, met his questions with ice. She didn't deny Kane's motives. She didn't even try to lie about the possibility that something darker was happening behind the scenes. Instead, she stared Devon down and answered with the kind of quiet, calculated bite that only someone who had been deeply hurt could deliver. Even if what you're asking is true, why would I ever tell you? The sentence was a dagger, laced with past betrayals and present rage. Because Amanda hadn't forgotten what she had seen. She hadn't forgotten walking into that living room and finding Devon, half-dressed, tangled in Abby Newman, in a moment they thought was private but had turned into a thunderclap of exposure. And worse, a Chancellor was there. Abby's husband. Amanda had watched as the truth collapsed into the air like smoke, poisoning everything. And now, Devon had the gall to stand before her, demanding clarity about another man's motives, when his own were no less cruel. It was galling. And Amanda wasn't in the mood to entertain hypocrisy. What made it worse was that Kane, manipulator that he was, had already laid the groundwork. He had given Amanda the power to silence Devon, to retaliate without lifting a finger. She didn't owe Devon anything anymore, not loyalty, not protection, not even information. And if Kane wanted to play puppet master, Amanda didn't mind playing the puppet once in a while, if only to watch Devon squirm. "You're worried Kane is distracting you?" she asked, voice sharp. "Maybe he is. But maybe your own guilt is doing a better job of it." Devon left that conversation angrier, but not wiser. Amanda had blocked his access, and Kane's own lawyer wasn't offering anything either. His calls were being rerouted, emails met with formal replies but no substance. The wall was up, and Devon had no idea what was happening on the other side. All he knew was that something was coming, and Kane was the conductor. Meanwhile, back at Newman Enterprises, Victor was meeting with his legal team, finally treating the Kane situation as the high-level threat Adam had insisted it was. Michael Baldwin had been on the edge of being courted by Kane twice. But even Michael, skilled at riding the line between loyalty and self-preservation, was pulling back. Not because Kane had lost power, but because he was becoming unpredictable. When power becomes volatile, Michael knew to keep distance. Still, that didn't mean he wasn't watching closely. At the Chancellor Mansion, whispers were forming. Staff had reported visitors at strange hours, coded deliveries, meetings held in rooms with curtains drawn. Kane had vanished from the public eye again, not out of weakness, but out of planning. Those who knew him best could sense it, he was preparing something. And what made it worse was that no one knew what it was. Not Devon. Not Lily. Not even Amanda. The mystery wasn't just about Kane's intentions. It was about who he had already recruited. Kyle Abbott may have been one of them. Diane Jenkins thought so. She had warned him more than once, about Kane, about Audra Charles, about the danger of attaching yourself to people who wear too many masks. But Kyle had stopped listening. Something had shifted in him since the France trip. Maybe it was the feeling of being excluded from the bigger moves. Maybe it was Audra's whispering voice, filling his ear with promises of independence. Or maybe it was just the inevitable evolution of a man who had spent too long living in other people's shadows. Kyle wanted something more. Kane seemed to offer that. And Diane was terrified of what it would cost him. She confronted him again that afternoon, face pale, eyes blazing. Audra is using you, she said. Kane is using both of you. But Kyle brushed her off. He was tired of being told what to do. He didn't want to be saved. He wanted to choose, even if he chose wrong. And while all of this unfolded, Kane sat in silence behind his estate's encrypted security systems, reading reports, watching encrypted feeds, logging interactions. He knew Devon was onto him. He knew Amanda had tipped her hand. He knew Adam had run to Victor. None of it surprised him. All of it was part of the plan. Because the real truth was this, Kane had never expected to reclaim Chancellor through a clean offer. That was the smoke. The fire had been burning elsewhere, through trusts, holding companies, backdoor agreements already locked in motion. While everyone watched the party, the real game was unfolding in silence, behind firewalls and names no one recognized. But there was one part of his plan he couldn't quite control, Lily. And it infuriated him. He had told Amanda he wanted her back. But that wasn't just nostalgia. That was structure. That was legacy. That was symmetry. Kane didn't just want Chancellor. He wanted the past to bow to him. He wanted the people who doubted him, Victor, Devon, Amanda, even Lily, to see that everything they had denied him, he now held in the palm of his hand. But Lily had changed. Amanda's warning hadn't been enough. Devon's pleading didn't move her. She had begun investigating on her own. And what she would soon discover, through a series of confidential memos and buried legal transfers, was that Kane was no longer circling Chancellor. He was about to own it. Not through Newman. Not through Winters. But through a shadow consortium built on everything they had missed while sipping wine in France. And the next time she looked into his eyes, it wouldn't be as a former lover or a scorned business partner. It would be as a woman watching a man rewrite history and place himself at the center of it. Kane Ashby had waited long enough. He had performed the charade, entertained the guests, faked the smiles, and extended the olive branches that no one genuinely wanted. The grand estate in France had served its purpose, just as he intended. Now that the masks had fallen and the alliances had begun to fracture, there was no more use for diplomacy. What remained was the reality of rejection, and Kane was finished pretending that he had moved on. Lily had made her choice, again. And though she would never admit it aloud, the disdain in her eyes when she looked at him said more than words ever could. Cain had reached for her once more, not just as a woman but as a symbol of everything he had built and lost. And she had crushed that hope beneath her heel with elegant precision. He had offered her redemption through reunion, and she had laughed in his face by kissing Damian Cain in plain view of the people he had gathered. If there had been a shred of restraint left in him, it had died in that moment. And now, Cain no longer saw Lily as the exception. She was part of the system that had discarded him. And systems, corporate, familial, emotional, could be dismantled. Cain's first targets would not be dramatic or reckless. He didn't operate that way anymore. He had learned patience in exile. Instead, his vengeance would begin surgically. Chancellor was ripe for destabilization, especially with Winters stretching itself thin across too many portfolios. Devon, for all his pride and savvy, had left cracks, legal, financial, and emotional. And Amanda Sinclair might just be the lever Cain needed. She was angry, emboldened, and more disillusioned than she cared to admit. He could see it in her eyes when Devon tried to question her loyalty, when Abby's betrayal still festered beneath the surface. Amanda might not want to destroy Devon, but she could certainly be tempted to wound him. And Cain would be there, gently fanning that fire, feeding her just enough truth to weaponize her instincts. He wouldn't need to order her to strike, just give her the blade and remind her how deep Devon's betrayal truly went. Meanwhile, across town, a different kind of storm was quietly building, one born not from revenge, but from fragility. Claire Grace Newman had spent months clawing her way toward healing, rebuilding a fractured identity with the cautious support of Victoria and the tenuous grace of the Newman name. But healing is not linear, and trauma doesn't vanish because a last name changes. This week, everything began to crack again. The panic returned, unexpected, relentless. The suffocating grip of fear took hold of her in the quiet corners of the Newman ranch, in the back seat of the car ride to the hospital, in the sterile hallways that carried too many echoes of abandonment. Claire couldn't explain it to Victoria without falling apart. But Holden understood. Holden Novak had arrived when no one else did. Not because he was instructed to, but because he saw her. Understood her. He had watched the room, not just the people. He noticed Claire withdrawing before she even spoke, noticed her shaking hands long before she admitted the panic. And when it overwhelmed her, he didn't ask questions, he simply guided her outside, grounding her with quiet words, calm presence, and no judgment. It was Holden, not a Newman, who helped Claire breathe again. And in that moment, something unspoken changed. A bond was sealed. Not in romance, not yet, but in dependence. Trust. And that kind of connection would not go away easily. It would grow. Especially when Kyle Abbott, ever unpredictable, began to unravel again under Audra Charles's manipulation. Claire would eventually have to choose whom she leaned on when the next storm came. And now, without even realizing it, she already had. Back in Chicago, another chapter of the Newman saga was unfolding as Victoria and Claire returned to see Cole, who was now hospitalized and fighting what appeared to be Legionnaire's disease. The call had come unexpectedly, the urgency in the nurse's voice too haunting to ignore. Victoria had dropped everything. Claire, despite her rising anxiety, followed without hesitation. When they arrived, Cole's condition had stabilized somewhat, but the emotional weight in the room was suffocating. He looked thinner, paler, his voice rough, but his eyes lit up when he saw them. He had feared he wouldn't get the chance to see Claire again, to tell Victoria that no matter how complicated their lives had been, he had never stopped caring. It was Claire who stood closest to his bedside. Cole looked at her as if trying to memorize her face, desperate to anchor himself to something real. He apologized for his absence, for every moment of doubt that had been planted by the people who had tried to rewrite her origin story. Victoria tried to hold it together, but the fragility in Cole's expression chipped away at her defenses. She told him they weren't going anywhere. That she and Claire were here now, and they would stay as long as needed. Cole nodded, whispering, "I thought I was going to die before I ever got to say goodbye." And yet, beneath the grief was confusion. Because Legionnaire's disease, while dangerous, was highly treatable. The statistics didn't add up. Even Victoria, who had once accepted medical diagnoses at face value, found herself asking more questions than usual. Why had his condition escalated so quickly? Why had he been admitted without contacting them earlier? And why did the hospital staff seem evasive when she asked about his treatment timeline? It was Claire who finally voiced it, softly, to Holden in the hallway later, "Something feels wrong." And she was right. Because buried in the hospital records were discrepancies. Dates that didn't match. Medications that had been administered too early, or not at all. Someone had either been careless or manipulative. Either way, it meant that Cole's illness may not have been as natural as everyone believed. And if that was the case, someone had wanted him isolated. Weak. Potentially silenced. Back in Genoa City, as Victoria began making phone calls and Claire buried herself in online medical journals, Kane Ashby was already preparing his next step. He had heard whispers of Cole's condition through a private contact and smiled, not at the illness, but at the opportunity it presented. Newman Enterprises was distracted. The Winter family was imploding. Jack Abbott was divided between business and family, unsure whether to trust Kyle anymore. And Amanda Sinclair, already emotionally untethered, had begun revisiting some of Kane's private files at his invitation, not to betray anyone yet, but just to understand what really happened. And still, Lily remained quiet. Watching. Processing. She had always been the calm before the storm. But Kane had a feeling she wasn't going to stay silent much longer. Because the next move he made wouldn't just challenge Chancellor or Winters. It would expose things buried for decades. It would make her question whether she had ever truly known him, or herself. The question wasn't whether Kane would retaliate. It was how many people would fall when he did. And whether any of them would recover. Let me know if you'd like the next installment to explore the mystery around Cole's medical treatment, Holden's growing role in Claire's emotional stability, or Amanda's choice between justice and revenge. You're absolutely right. The Young and the Restless has a long, often head-scratching history of writing around medical facts, reworking character arcs on a whim, and making bold story choices that leave viewers scrambling for logic. The idea that Cole could die from Legionnaire's disease is, frankly, absurd when you look at real-world mortality rates and treatment efficacy. As you pointed out, 90 to 95% survival rate in healthy individuals makes his death feel narratively forced, unless, of course, his illness was no accident. And that's where things get juicy, because this is YNR, and logic rarely gets in the way of drama. DNA: if Cole dies, it has to be murder, not medicine. The best way to justify Cole's collapse would be to turn his Legionnaire's diagnosis into a red herring. A manipulated chart. A planted infection. A bacteria-laced humidifier at his hotel room. Maybe someone dosed his four with something after admission. A genetically engineered strain, maybe even linked to biotech sabotage. Why? Because it finally gives meaning to a plotline that otherwise feels lazy and cheap. In that version, Cole becomes the first victim in a broader mystery, and possibly the martyr figure that pushes Claire into full heroine mode. Firecracker: so who would kill Cole, and why? Let's entertain the soap logic. Kane might have seen Cole as a threat to his return to power campaign, especially if Cole was going to testify or sign over part of Chancellor, or maybe knew something about the Newman-Dumas ties. Audra Charles could be using Claire and needed Cole out of the way to destabilize her emotionally. Kyle, twisted by power and manipulation, could have played a role without realizing how far it would go, making for a redemption arc later. Claire herself, if we go full psychological thriller, could have been an unwitting pawn in someone else's scheme, maybe carrying the bacteria unknowingly. Performing arts meanwhile, about Chancellor. You're right to notice the weird sidelining of Connor Floyd's Chance. Despite being tied to the Chancellor legacy and the Abby Devon storyline, he's had minimal presence lately. If the show recasts Chance again or kills him off, it wouldn't be shocking, just disappointing. Possible reasons for that: budget cuts, as you mentioned. Keeping a legacy name like Chance while underusing him feels like a waste of both salary and screen time. They may be building toward a reshuffling of the Chancellor legacy, with Devon, Abby, and possibly Kane in a power struggle. Removing Chance makes it easier for that arc to unfold without the default heir. It could also be a misdirection. They want fans to think Chance is on the chopping block so a real twist lands harder later, i.e., someone else dies. Crystal ball final thoughts? You're asking the right questions, and honestly, you're already writing a better version of this storyline than what's currently aired. Cole's death only works if it's part of a murder arc. Chance's fate needs clarity: either commit or release. Claire and Holden's rising bond might be the most emotionally grounded thread, and it could be the key to unlocking both storylines. If you want, I can write the next chapter where Cole's illness is revealed to be deliberate. Claire spirals emotionally and begins investigating with Holden. Chance discovers a clue just before he vanishes, or is silenced. Lily and Amanda link the infection to something Kane is hiding. Would you like me to do that?